Hello everyone! Once again, another Vanguard deck profile, this time on the set release for set 2 with Blangdmire, or the faded one of Zero. Because Blangdmire looks cool, I like the playstyle of banishing everything basically, and basically very similar to Vanish Delete. I kinda like that. The Grim Reaper-like design, also really cool, and funny enough, same artist like Chaos Breaker. And the background is awesome. But with those out of the way, I have to say the deck is basically just unique in its own way where we bring back binding face down. And also, the divine skill is pretty powerful, but once you've used up the divine skill, the deck kind of stagnates. So keep those things in mind, but other than that, it's basically just binding from soul face down and then just bind more stuff face down. That's the main focus of the deck. Of course, with more support in the future, this might change up a bit, but other than that, there's really not much to say. And now let's start off with the ride deck. So here's the starter, choose whichever one you want, in which we go to Hollow Raptor, where when you ride the grade 2, look at top 3 cards from your deck to soul charge everything that is basically non-trigger, or basically grade 1s and higher. Now, keep in mind about one thing. You're going to be soul charging all your non-trigger units, which could also mean your key pieces. And that is one weakness with the deck too, because you can lack a field presence because of that. In which we go to the grade 2, which does exactly the same thing except when you ride the grade 3. So when you ride the grade 3, Blangdmire, the grade 2 activates of course, but the skills of the grade 3 of Faded 1-0, where when it attacks the Vanguard, bind from 2 to 4 cards from your soul face down, hence why you want to do all the soul charging, and then you draw a card. And then you bound 4 more cards, your opponent chooses 2 of their rear guards and bind them face down and plus 5k for each one. So first grade 3 attack, you're going to very likely bind 4 face down. So you can get plus additional 10k because for every 2 cards bound, so that's a total of 4 and that's a total of 10k, and basically you get a draw, which is something the deck really needs as well because extra draw really helps. But it's mainly to build up for the second skill, which is the finisher, the divine skill, where at the beginning of the guard step on the attack, if you have at least 8 cards bound, critical +1, and your opponent cannot use sentinels to guard for the attack, and your opponent's Vanguard loses all its skills. Basically, your opponent is kind of deleted for a whole turn except without the 0. And basically the idea is that your opponent's Vanguard ends up with nothing. And that itself is pretty powerful if your opponent cannot re-ride. So basically, once you meet the condition of 8 bound, you're going to get plus 20k, 1 crit, and a guard restrict. Yeah, that can finish off games right there, and I really like it. And also the fact that it just makes your opponent lose their skills. If they can't re-ride, then they're kind of screwed. And yes, your opponent also loses the drive checks as well, meaning that your opponent's Vanguard loses their twin drive, which goes back to 1 drive check, because all Vanguards get at least 1 drive check. But overall, it's just a pretty cool skill. Since this is the divine skill, you have to finish off your opponent by then. If you don't finish off your opponent by then, you're kind of screwed. So I do recommend try to build up as much power as possible for this one skill. But other than that, there's really not much to say. So that's it for the ride deck. To the main deck, obviously 3 more for Persona Ride because you want to build up all the power, and Persona Ride is always good. And then we go to Single Strikes Colossus, which is 4 copies. So when this card attacks a Vanguard, if your bind zone has at least 4 cards face down plus 10k, so when you put it to soul because of any ability, the second skill activates, where when you put it to ability from a soul, when this card is put to soul from a card ability, if you have at least a grade 3 Blangdmire, bind this card face down to draw a card. Even from the random soul charging, you can still activate the skill, so it's very helpful. And it basically increases your bind count. Right now, there's really not too much point of it, I must admit, but later on, as more binds add up, this might actually matter. But for now, this extra bind doesn't really matter too much since Blangdmire itself already binds 4, and second turn you're going to bind another 4, which will make a total of 8. But other than that, it's still pretty decent for some extra draws. And then finally, for the last grade 3, I run Microslavia because Microslava, when placed from hand, you can count on last 1 to choose a card grade less than or equal to your Vanguard. If it's a grade 3, put it in your hand. If it's not, you call it to rearguard and plus 5k. This is something that is really helpful for the deck because you're going to be soul charging a lot of non-trigger units of soul. So just being able to call some stuff back from soul is just very nice. So that's why I run 3. I'm thinking about bumping this up to 4. I tried it with 2, didn't really work out. So right now 3 is a pretty good number. But I'm thinking of running 4 just so I could get those resources back from soul. And then to the grade 2 lineup, first off there's Zamug, where on place on Vanguard, if you have at least a grade 3 Blangdmire, cost count loss 1, reveal the top 3 cards of your deck to choose any number from among them, put them to soul. And if you put at least 1, you draw a card, which is of course going to be very helpful. But the main part is the second skill, because that's the pressure skill, where when this card attacks, if you have at least a grade 3 Blangdmire and your crit is 1 or less, you can energy blast 3 to give this card plus 5k and 1 crit. Just to let you know, you're going to be able to restand your rear guards, and it could be any rear guard. So having a 15k attacker with extra crit can be very pressuring, and then just being able to restand it with extra crit is also very pressuring, especially when you get extra crits. Overall, this is actually pretty good, and that's why you must run 4 of this, especially with the extra soul charging. And then next, I prefer to run this because I kind of actually like it, is the Crimson Spectre. Because when this card attacks, you can soul charge 1, but that's not the main part. The main part is that it's the soul ability where you can counter blast 1, put this card to drop, and soul charge 1, and then choose your Vanguard plus 10k. You're going to be soul charging your non-trigger units. So this is just basically a good soul charge target, and also extra power to your Vanguard while refilling your soul. That's why I actually kind of like this card for the deck. Of course, there might be other better stuff, but I actually found this card very useful, which is why I'm running this. And then next, I just run the discard fodder, because discard fodder for the extra draw is pretty nice, especially when you're using 3 energy. You might not really be using the energy too much, since this deck is not too counterblast heavy either. So it is personal preference how you want to do it, but I don't run 4 of these because usually when more booster sets come out, you're going to be taking them out because you're going to be lacking space, so I'm not running 4 of these. So that's it for the grade 2 lineup. For the grade 1 lineup, first off, Evoke Alchemist, where it's basically the 13k booster or 15k booster when it's behind the Vanguard, and when it's behind the Blangdmire Vanguard and becoming the 15k booster and you have 4 more bound cards, you can counterblast 1, choose one of your front row rear guards and stand it, and if your bound has 8 or more, plus additional 15k. So basically, once you get your 8 bind, finish off your opponent with a 20k buff. That's pretty nice. Overall, this is just pretty strong because it's one of the best Fated 1 boosters we got, being able to restand one of your rear guards. And that's what I mean, that you can basically restand Zamug for basically 2 attacks with extra crits. And then next, we go to Steam Artist Arwen. Yes, a lot of Gear Chronicle theme here. On place, you can soul charge 1, so that's nice. And if you have at least a grade 3 Blangdmire, you can look at the top 2 cards from your deck instead and put them all to soul. That's up to you, but you can even just choose 1 from there. But the second skill is back row rearguard at the end of the turn. If your Vanguard Blangdmire gets a crit from the Divine skill, you can retire this unit to draw a card, and then, if you did not play the same ability this turn, you can choose one of your opponent's Vanguard that gets this ability. At the beginning of the ride phase, if your opponent would ride a card, they must discard a card from hand. Basically, it's like Deleter with Oxus, where you force your opponent to discard a card if they choose to ride from a deleted state. This basically just makes it harder for your opponent to make a choice whether they could ride or not, especially if they only have 1 card in hand. Overall, it's just extra pressure, but it's not super necessary, but I do kind of like it, especially with the soul charge. And then finally, Brainwash Swirler. You could technically take some of these out because it's just random soul charge and generic and plus extra 5k power buff, which is also very nice. And in some cases, the extra power buff is very good, especially when you boost it with Blangdmire and Divine Skill. And finally, 4 PGs. And then the trigger lineup for OT, 8 crits, 3 draws because you kind of need the draw power, and finally the 4 heals with 2 counter heals. So that's it for the new Blangdmire deck. What do you guys think of it? What other choices would you make, or what changes would you make, and what other cards would you recommend? So far, I'm liking the deck how it is. I'm just making this deck profile now since I know set 3 is not going to have any Blangdmire stuff, so I decided to do this now instead of waiting for set 4. And overall, I kind of like it. Brings back the bind face down concept, and basically make your opponent with nothing, hence the name with 0. And kind of brings back the delete concept along with vanish delete, and also the design is pretty cool. But in that, there's really not much to say about it other than basically build up for a ticking time bomb with a lot of cool art design. But on that, that's it for this, and see you all next time.